Humans are a tropical animal. Everything about the basic design says so. Bare skin, abundant sweat glands, long limbs suited to shedding heat, and almost no insulating fat compared with animals that live in cold places. Drop an unequipped person into a snowy landscape, and the outcome is measured in hours. And yet people were living through northern European winters at least 40,000 years ago, and in Siberia, in conditions considerably worse at least 30,000 years ago. Some of those winters were during glacial periods, meaning colder and longer than anything a modern European experiences. So the question of what they did when it snowed has a real answer, and it is not that they endured it. Enduring cold is what you do when you have failed. What they actually did was build an artificial tropical environment around their bodies and carry it with them. Let's dig into this properly because the physical problem has to be understood first. Body heat is generated by metabolism and lost to the environment through four routes: radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. In cold conditions, all four run against you at once. Radiation carries heat away toward colder surroundings. Conduction pulls it into anything cold you touch, and cold ground is a serious and underrated threat. Convection strips warmth from the skin as air moves across it, which is what wind chill describes. Evaporation removes heat as moisture leaves the skin, which is normally useful and becomes lethal when you are wet. The human response to cold is limited. Blood vessels near the skin constrict, reducing flow to the surface and keeping warm blood in the core, which protects vital organs and sacrifices the extremities. Shivering generates heat through rapid muscle contraction at a substantial metabolic cost. Neither is remotely sufficient in serious cold, and both are expensive. There is real physiological adaptation in populations living in cold regions. Differences in body proportions consistent with conserving heat. Variations in how blood vessels in the hands respond to cold, and differences in metabolic response. And all of it is marginal against the scale of the problem. No amount of adaptation substitutes for a fur coat, and humans did not have time to grow one. Let's talk about clothing first, because it is the answer that made everything else possible. The critical distinction is between draped and tailored. A hide thrown over the shoulders helps a little. Fitted garments with sewn seams, sleeves, leggings, closed footwear, hoods, trap a layer of still air against the body, and still air is an excellent insulator. That trapped layer, rather than the material itself, does most of the work. Tailoring requires needles, and eyed bone needles appear in the archaeological record from roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago, with some of the oldest examples from Siberian sites, which is exactly where you would expect the technology to be under most pressure. It also requires thread, sinew or plant fiber, and awls to pierce hide, and the tools for scraping and softening hides, which are considerably older. Evidence for what these garments looked like comes from unusual sources. The burials at Sunghyr in Russia contained thousands of ivory beads arranged in patterns across the bodies, and the positions of those beads have been used to reconstruct fitted clothing, including what appear to have been shirts, trousers, footwear, and headgear. The clothes themselves rotted. The beads sewn onto them stayed where they fell. Footwear matters more than people assume. Feet are in constant contact with cold ground, and conduction through that contact drains heat rapidly, while frostbitten feet immobilize a person entirely. Direct evidence for early footwear is scarce because it decomposes, and there is an indirect line of argument based on changes in toe bone robustness in skeletal remains, which has been used to suggest supportive footwear was in use considerably earlier than any surviving example. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because clothing is not merely helpful in cold conditions. It is the enabling technology for the entire northern occupation of the planet. Fire is fixed in place and cannot be carried while hunting. Shelter must be left. Clothing is the only warmth that travels with you, and everything else in this account is downstream of it. Let's talk about who was already there too, because modern humans arriving in cold Europe found it occupied. Neanderthals had been living through European winters for a very long time before our species arrived, across multiple glacial cycles, and their bodies show adaptation to it in ways ours do not. Shorter limbs relative to torso length, broader trunks, and heavier builds all reduce the surface area available for heat loss relative to volume. which is the pattern seen across cold-adapted mammals generally. Estimates of their metabolic requirements suggest they burned more energy than modern humans of comparable size. That combination gave them a real advantage in cold and a real cost, a body that requires more fuel needs more successful hunting. Their toolkits and sites indicate they managed, with evidence of hide processing, controlled fire, and hunting of large cold climate game. What they appear to have lacked, on current evidence, is the tailoring. Eyed needles are essentially absent from Neanderthal contexts, while awls and scraping tools are present, which has been read as indicating clothing that was draped and wrapped rather than fitted and sewn. Some researchers have modeled the insulation difference and argued it was significant, particularly at the extremities. Others caution that absence of needles does not establish absence of fitted clothing, since alternative methods of joining hide exist and organic tools would not survive. Whatever the explanation, the pattern in the archaeology is that modern human occupation extended further into extremely cold regions, including deep into Siberia, than Neanderthal occupation appears to have done. That is one factor among several that researchers have proposed in accounting for what happened between the two populations, and it should be treated as a partial contribution to a question that remains thoroughly unresolved. Let's talk about fire too, because it did more than provide heat. Controlled fire long predates modern humans, and by the periods in question, it was thoroughly established. In cold climates, its uses multiply. It provided direct warmth, obviously, and in a well-constructed shelter, a modest fire raises the internal temperature substantially. It provided light through long winter nights, which at high latitudes are very long indeed, extending the hours in which work like tool-making, hide processing, and sewing could be done. It dried clothing, which is a survival function rather than a comfort, since wet insulation stops working, and wet clothing in cold conditions is dangerous. It thawed frozen food and water, and eating snow directly costs body heat in quantities that matter. Fuel was the constraint. Forested regions supply wood. The open steppe and tundra, where much of this occupation happened, do not, and people there burned bone, which requires a hot initial fire to ignite and then burns effectively, along with dung and rendered fat. Sites in cold, open environments show hearths with substantial quantities of burnt bone, which is direct evidence of fuel strategy adapting to what the landscape offered. Let's talk about the snow specifically too, because it is not simply an obstacle and the distinction shaped how people used a landscape. Snow is an excellent insulator. Air trapped between crystals gives it a low thermal conductivity, which is why animals shelter beneath it and why snow structures work as dwellings. The material that makes the surface lethal makes an interior survivable. Traditional snow shelters used across Arctic regions in recent centuries exploit exactly this, with internal temperatures far above the outside air, raised further by body heat and a small flame. Whether people in the deep past built snow shelters is unknown and unknowable, since a structure made of snow leaves no trace whatsoever. The materials were available and the physics does not change, so it is entirely plausible and entirely unevidenced. Snow cover also changes what a landscape offers. It conceals plant foods and makes ground travel harder, particularly in deep, soft conditions, and it simultaneously makes tracking dramatically easier. An animal crossing fresh snow leaves a complete record of where it went, how fast, and how long ago, which is an enormous advantage for hunters and one that disappears the moment the ground is bare. Deep snow also impedes large animals more than it impedes a person on foot with any kind of flotation, and hunting strategies exploiting that difference are documented ethnographically. Frozen water bodies alter routes as well. A frozen river or lake is a flat, obstacle-free surface, and in many northern regions, winter travel is easier than summer travel for exactly that reason, since frozen ground and ice replace bog and open water. The serious hazards were wet snow and wind. Getting soaked destroys insulation and turns cold conditions into an emergency, and wind multiplies convective heat loss enormously. Dry cold in still air is manageable with adequate clothing. Wet cold with wind is what kills people then and now. Let's talk about shelter too, because the structures involved are more impressive than the word suggests. Caves and rock overhangs were used where available, and they are considerably better than open ground. Stable temperature, protection from wind and precipitation, and a defensible entrance. They are also fixed in place, and people following game across a landscape needed portable or rapidly constructible options. The most striking evidence comes from mammoth bone structures found across the East European plain, at the sites in Ukraine and Russia. These were built from mammoth bones and tusks arranged into circular and oval frameworks, some using hundreds of bones, including large numbers of skulls and mandibles, arranged in deliberate patterns. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The bones would have formed a frame covered with hides, weighted at the base, producing a substantial insulated dwelling. Some of these sites contain multiple structures, hearths, and storage pits, indicating settlements occupied for extended periods rather than overnight camps. Whether the mammoths were hunted or the bones collected from natural accumulations is debated, and either way the construction represents planning, engineering, and cooperative labor. Semi-subterranean designs appear as well, with floors dug below ground level, which exploits the fact that Earth below the frost line stays warmer than the air and provides insulation on all sides. Let's talk about the social side too, because cold environments impose requirements on groups that warm ones do not. Almost nothing described so far can be done alone. Constructing a mammoth bone dwelling requires several people. Intercepting a migration requires coordinated positioning. Processing a large kill before it spoils or is taken by scavengers requires many hands working fast. Preparing hides and sewing clothing for a group is an enormous labor investment, and the archaeological evidence for it, quantities of scrapers, awls, and needles, indicates substantial time spent on it. Division of labor follows from that. A group in which everyone does everything is less efficient than one where people specialize, and while the archaeology cannot show who did what, the volume of work implied by the material record indicates it was distributed rather than duplicated. Risk pooling matters as much. Hunting large animals fails frequently, and a single household relying on its own success would starve during any run of bad luck. Sharing across a group converts individual variability into collective stability, and food sharing is documented as a strong norm across foraging societies studied in recent times, frequently with elaborate rules about distribution. There is also the transmission problem. The knowledge required to survive a northern winter, where animals move and when, how to build, how to process hides, how much to store, which conditions are dangerous, is far too much for one person to work out. It has to be taught, which means older members who no longer hunt effectively still carry essential value, and which places a premium on any means of holding and passing on information accurately. That combination is why some researchers argue that cold environments favored larger, better connected social networks. Evidence for long-distance movement of materials, shell, particular stone types, ornaments, across substantial distances in these periods is frequently interpreted as tracing contact networks that would also have carried information and provided support during bad seasons. Let's talk about food too, because the calorie problem in cold conditions is severe. Staying warm burns energy, and a person in cold conditions needs substantially more food than the same person in a temperate climate. At the same time, winter is when plant foods are least available. The answer was animals, and the archaeological record from cold climate sites shows heavy reliance on large game. Mammoth, reindeer, horse, bison, and others depending on region. Isotope analysis of remains from some northern populations indicates diets extremely high in animal protein and fat, comparable to what has been documented in recent Arctic peoples. Fat mattered more than protein. There is a physiological limit to how much protein the human body can process, and a diet of very lean meat without sufficient fat or carbohydrate produces a serious condition sometimes described in accounts of Arctic exploration. Marrow, brain, and body fat were therefore high-value targets, and bone breakage patterns at many sites show systematic extraction of marrow. Storage was the other half. Cold climates offer a substantial advantage here, since freezing preserves food indefinitely, and storage pits dug into permafrost or frozen ground appear at northern sites. Drying and smoking supplemented it. A group that could preserve a large kill through winter had solved the hardest seasonal problem, and the ability to store surplus is one of the main things separating survival from repeated crisis. Let's talk about the seasonal round too, because the strategy was as much about timing as technology. Groups in cold regions generally did not distribute themselves evenly through the year. Patterns visible in the archaeological record suggest aggregation at particular seasons and dispersal at others, timed around the movements of migratory animals and the availability of resources. Reindeer migration is the clearest example, delivering enormous numbers of animals through predictable routes at predictable times, and sites positioned at crossing points and narrows show repeated use across long periods. A group that intercepted a migration successfully could take enough animals to supply months of food, hides for clothing, bone for fuel and tools, and sinew for thread, all in a short window. That planning requirement is significant in itself. Surviving a northern winter meant deciding in autumn what would be needed in February, and being right. It required knowledge of the landscape, of animal behavior, and of how much a group consumes, held and transmitted across generations. Let's talk about how we know any of this too, because cold climate archaeology has an unusual advantage and an unusual gap. The advantage is preservation. Cold and frozen ground slows or halts decomposition, and permafrost sites have produced organic material of a quality that temperate archaeology almost never sees. Wooden objects, cordage, hide fragments, and, in exceptional cases, frozen animal remains complete with soft tissue. Ancient DNA also survives far better in cold conditions, which is why so much of the genetic work on ancient populations has come from northern latitudes. The gap is that the periods concerned were colder than today, meaning ice sheets covered a great deal of the relevant territory, and sea levels were much lower, so coastal sites of the era are now offshore. Glacial advance also physically destroys what lies beneath it, scraping landscapes clean. Substantial portions of the record were removed by the same conditions the record is about. There is a further complication in interpreting what does survive. A site occupied during a cold period may have been used only in summer, and establishing seasonality requires specific evidence. Tooth eruption stages in animal remains indicating age at death, growth increments, or the presence of species available only at particular times. Without it, a site in a cold region says nothing about whether anyone was there in winter. Experimental archaeology has filled some gaps by testing whether proposed methods actually work. Researchers have built replica shelters and measured internal temperatures, produced clothing using period-appropriate tools and materials, and tested its insulation, burned bone to establish fuel properties, and attempted hide processing with stone tools. That work has repeatedly shown that techniques dismissed as implausible are effective, and occasionally that reconstructions assumed to be straightforward are considerably harder than they look. Let's talk about the toll too, because an account of successful adaptation can make it sound easier than it was. Skeletal remains from cold climate populations of these periods show the marks of hard lives. Healed fractures are common, and the pattern of injuries in some Neanderthal remains has been compared to what occurs in occupations involving close contact with large animals. Enamel defects indicating episodes of severe illness or malnutrition during childhood appear frequently, which is direct evidence of periods when food ran short. Winter would have been when the margin was thinnest. A failed autumn hunt, a store raided by animals, an injury to a key member of a small group, or a season of unusually deep snow-limiting travel would each convert a workable situation into a crisis, and there was very little buffer. Population densities in these regions were extremely low, which reflects exactly that constraint. The land could support only so many people through the worst months. Frostbite and its consequences leave less clear skeletal evidence than one might expect, since damaged extremities may be lost without distinctive bone signatures, and the practical effects were presumably severe. Respiratory problems from smoke inside enclosed shelters are a plausible chronic cost, and soot deposits in some sites indicate the interiors were smoky. None of that diminishes the achievement. It contextualizes it. These were populations operating close to the limit, sustained by technology and knowledge that worked well enough, most of the time, in conditions where being wrong once could end a group entirely. The archaeological record contains sites that were occupied and then abandoned, and regions that were settled and then emptied during colder phases, which is what failure looks like from this distance. Let's talk about the toolkit too, because the technology of cold living shows up in stone before it shows up in anything else. Sites in cold regions display a characteristic emphasis on tools for working hide and bone rather than only for butchery. Scrapers appear in large numbers, frequently showing heavy wear and repeated resharpening, which indicates sustained processing of skins rather than occasional use. Burins for engraving and grooving bone, awls for piercing, and needles for sewing form a recognizable package. There is also a shift in how stone itself was used. Producing long, regular blades from a prepared core yields far more cutting edge per unit of raw material than older methods, which matters enormously in landscapes where good stone is scarce and where a group is moving frequently and cannot carry much. Some northern assemblages show extremely economical use of stone, with cores worked down to almost nothing and tools resharpened until they were barely usable. Composite tools became more prominent as well, points and blades set into handles and shafts of bone, antler, or wood, held with adhesive and binding. That construction lets a small piece of stone do the work of a much larger one, allows damaged components to be replaced without discarding the whole implement, and makes better use of materials available locally. Bone and antler took on roles that wood plays elsewhere, which matters in treeless environments. Antler in particular is tough and slightly flexible, resistant to shattering in cold conditions where stone becomes brittle, and it was worked into points, shafts, and handles. The general pattern is a toolkit shaped less by what people wanted to hunt and more by what the environment failed to provide. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. Early humans in snow did not tolerate cold. They eliminated it locally using a combination of technologies that reinforced each other. Tailored clothing, made possible by eyed needles from roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago, trapped still air against the body and provided the only warmth that could be carried while moving. Fire supplied heat, light through very long nights, dried clothing, and thawed food, with bone and fat burned as fuel where wood was absent. Shelters ranged from occupied caves to substantial constructed dwellings, including mammoth bone frameworks covered with hides and semi-subterranean designs using the ground itself as insulation. Diet shifted heavily toward animal fat and protein, with marrow and fat prioritized, and cold season storage exploited freezing conditions to hold surplus through the months when nothing could be obtained. And the whole system depended on a seasonal strategy timed around animal migrations, requiring planning across months and knowledge accumulated over generations, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. A species built for the African savanna walked into landscapes where the temperature alone would have killed it within a day, and did it not by changing its body, but by learning to carry a piece of warm climate along, stitched together with a bone needle.